Right. Hi, everybody. I hope you're all having a good re:Invent so far. I see some folks nodding their heads, so I think that's a good sign. Really nice to be with you today and have 60 minutes of your time. What we're going to be talking about today is DevOps for mobile web apps with serverless backends. Before I talk about what exactly that means, I'll introduce myself. My name is Mohit Srivastav. I'm a senior manager of product management in AWS Mobile. So we build services and tools targeting mobile developers, both native developers, cross-platform developers using tools like React Native, as well as mobile web developers, which is what this talk is about. So what do we mean? Generally, when we talk about mobile web apps with serverless backends, we mean SPA-style applications, so apps that use static HTML, static JavaScript, static CSS, images, but deliver dynamic functionality using fully managed services. So things like Amazon Cognito for auth, DynamoDB and AppSync for offline and real-time data, and then Pinpoint for analytics. Just show of hands, like how many folks here are using some kind of single page application style? Okay, good. You guys are in the correct talk. That's great. One more disclaimer. So this is a pattern we see a lot from our customers increasingly because it's a way to deliver to both iOS, Android, as well as desktop with a single code base. That said, there's no single answer for the right architecture, nor is there a single right answer for DevOps. So take away the nuggets that make sense for you, obviously, but no hurt feelings if you don't actually use everything I talk about in this talk. That makes complete sense. All right, since we're still early in re:Invent, here's some other sessions that might be worth your time. Right after this is, although in the Venetian, is the State of the Union. So you'll hear more about what I'm talking about in this talk, plus more broadly, everything we're doing in AWS Mobile. That's at 2:30 in Venetian. And then tomorrow we have a couple of really cool talks. We actually have the CEO of Ionic speaking tomorrow. Ionic is a very popular cross-platform kind of framework targeting iOS and Android as well. He's actually going to be here tomorrow announcing a bunch of stuff that Ionic is delivering, as well as integration between Ionic and Amplify, or Ionic and us. So if you use Ionic, highly recommend this talk. You actually get to see the CEO speak, make announcements, and be part of that. And then another cool talk tomorrow is basically mobile web, how you do real-time and offline and AI/ML. So if you're looking to put these kinds of things in your app, could be a very relevant talk as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So we'll start with a customer. The customer that we profiled here is a company called Gunner Technology. Presumably, like a lot of you here, they're a web development shop, and they service a bunch of different verticals. So they service government agencies, startups, and businesses, and they're constantly building new apps and prototypes. And the way they get their edge, in fact, is by being able to deliver really fast. So they can support customers' needs for fast prototypes. They can support customers' needs for getting to market quickly. All that said, they're very deliberate about dedicated AWS accounts for their projects to make sure that each project is fully isolated from a DevOps perspective, and each project is fully isolated from a hosting perspective. So over the years, they've kind of built out a set of principles that I think are actually very relevant for this talk. And it's a full stack approach for DevOps for web apps. And it's defined by some of these principles here. So the first one is what we just talked about, a really strong isolation barrier between projects and stages. So what that means in their particular case is a dedicated account, not just for every project, but a dedicated account for every stage. And that way only the developers who need to access a particular stage and work on a particular stage are able to do that. One thing interesting here is they chose to partition their AWS accounts by project and stage as opposed to front-end and back-end. So just keep a mental note of that as this talk goes along. Next piece is there's a one-to-one mapping between source control and what actually gets deployed. So in their case, and what we see from customers, a repository, a Git, in their case, a code commit repository, but it could be a GitHub repository, maps very directly to a project, and then a branch in source control maps very directly to a stage. So my dev branch in source control could be my dev branch, or my dev stage, and vice versa. The next thing that they do that's kind of interesting is they minimize version mismatches between the front end and back end by working on both things together. So I'll show you some examples later, but if you look at the repo structure, you'll see their React Native code, their React.js code, and all the CloudFormation templates for their app kind of co-located. And the benefit of that is everything gets deployed as a unit, so the chance of the front end and back end drifting and causing errors gets diminished. And not necessarily the right pattern for everybody, but it can, it certainly can work in these kind of use cases. And then finally, the developers are full stack developers. The developers are in full control. They can deploy the front end and back end. Okay, so let's take a step back and just make sure we level set on the architecture we're talking about before we dive into the DevOps. So the single page style app we're talking about is defined by two pieces, the front end and the back end, not surprisingly. And here's what the front end looks like typically. So the front end request will hit an edge location, CloudFront in the location that's closest to the end user, and then that will get routed to the origin. The origin is typically just a fancy word for where your assets live. So in this case, it's an S3 bucket. Nice thing about the front end design this way, it's highly cacheable, works really well with CDNs, et cetera. And then what happens is the front end will make a JavaScript request or a series of JavaScript requests typically to the back end. So in this case, it's making a request to AppSync to fetch data from Lambda and DynamoDB. Okay. So there are some unique DevOps requirements for this style of app. So obviously, there's just the general DevOps best practice. Infrastructure as code. All of your backend should be described as CloudFormation templates, for example, that you can check into source control, share with teammates. But there are some unique requirements as well. So the first one is the one you see on the left, which is in many cases you might want your developers to work in full isolation. So think about the full stack developer. They want to add a feature that spans front end and back end. They probably want to be able to take the CloudFormation templates that somebody else worked on, manipulate them, deploy a completely isolated stack, and then write front-end code against that isolated stack. That said, when they're done using Git, using kind of Git methodology and Git flow, they would want their back-end code to flow, to test, and get merged properly, and then to prod and get merged properly, and we'll see how we can do that. Alternatively, there are cases where that developer may want to not do the isolated backend and use the shared backend instead. Perhaps the shared backend has a data set that they want to use that will really stress whether the front-end code is written properly. So there are legitimate cases where you want a shared backend as well. Okay. And then it's kind of an alternate way of looking at it is like this, which I kind of like. So the life cycle of an app is development and deployment. So now if you kind of take what I just talked about and make it something tangible, this is how it could look, right? The developer creates a CloudFormation template for their backend features. As they do that, they need to create an environment specifically for that CloudFormation template that's just for them. And then ultimately, they want to make sure that their front end is wired up to the back end. So there's the obvious things like configuration settings. So if I'm using Amazon Cognito, my front end needs to reference that Amazon Cognito instance. But there's some of the non-obvious things as well. Like increasingly, some of our backend services do code generation, like API Gateway as well as AppSync. So you also want to make sure that you can reference the backend for doing code generation. Yeah. Alternatively, you might choose an existing backend, and you need to wire up your backend to your front end. So this is kind of typical in a full stack, right? I'm working on the backend. Every time I update the backend, I need to be able to deploy it in an isolated, environment just for me, and then make sure my front end and back end are wired up. And then when you graduate from development to deployment, the person doing the deployment would use the same CloudFormation templates. The difference here, though, is they're not going to use the environment settings that the developer created. They're going to use their own environment settings specific to the deployment environment, like test or stage or prod. And then there has to be some magic that wires up the front end to the back end. So that's a lot of, if you think about all, I'll go back one slide. So you think about all the moving parts in our architecture, plus these different workflows, there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong, and a lot of stuff that can take a lot of time. And in particular, that can be at odds with being able to ship fast. It can be at odds with working as a team. It can be at odds with having something that's globally scalable. So with that in mind, we launched a new product. It was going to launch actually today, right now, but it launched Sunday. With that in mind, we launched something recently called the AWS Amplify console, and that's really designed to serve the DevOps needs for these mobile web apps that we've been talking about. And it really supports two kinds. It supports the existing single-page web app that you have that might not have a backend at all. For example, a site that uses Jekyll or an app that uses Gatsby, and there's no backend yet. You can literally just wire it up and deploy it, and you'll see that in a minute. But it also supports these full-stack web apps, front-end plus back-end, that have been built using another thing my team delivers called the Amplify CLI, where you can take a front-end, you can gradually add back-end features, stitch it all together, and then deploy it using the Amplify console. In both cases, the same kind of design principles hold. You wire up your repository, you configure build settings, and your app is deployed for you. We've tried to make it really, really easy, whether you're just doing the front end, just doing the SPA, or if you're doing the SPA plus the back end. And I apologize, it's a little bit small, but some of the features that we've then put into this product, the first thing is it's fully managed hosting. So when you use the Amplify console to host your SPA, the CloudFront and we use CloudFront and S3 and Lambda Edge under the covers, but those things aren't actually in your account. They're fully managed. And by virtue of them being fully managed, we can deliver a bunch of value to the customer. The first one is it's globally available because it is using CloudFront and S3. Perhaps more interestingly, deployments are atomic. So what we do is when you upload your source code, we make sure that it's fully uploaded to the S3 bucket before we flip an internal pointer to point to your new source code or to your new site as opposed to your old site. And that we can do because we have a Lambda Edge instance that's fully managed. And then also we can offer just turnkey password protection. So you flip a button and your site is password protected. And that's again because we have a Lambda Edge instance running between your artifacts and CloudFront and S3. And then underlying again throughout our design is this kind of Git motivated workflow. Everything is driven off of how Git is structured. You have branches, you can wire up those branches really easy to a workflow, and you could do front end only or front end plus back end. And basically this talk's going to be the first half front end and the second half front end plus back end, so you can see how it all fits together. Okay. And some of the use cases, you can do a static web app, or you can do a serverless web app, which is a web app plus backend. And you might be wondering, why did we call this thing the Amplify console? In fact, I've seen tweets asking the same thing, although not as nicely as I just did. Like, why did you call this thing the Amplify console? That's kind of weird. Well, we've taken everything that we offer for front-end developers, so namely mobile developers and web developers, and we've launched it under this term AWS Amplify as of Sunday. So when we say front-end developers, we support iOS and Android native. We support web, which is what this talk is about, and we support React Native. And it consists of 3 parts. An open source framework, which we've had for the last year. It consists of cloud services that are integrated easily with the framework. So when you use the framework, you can say things like Amplify add auth instead of Amplify add cognito. And we, under the covers, use best practice with AWS to configure that. And then finally, it's developer tools. So the first half of this talk is about the developer tool, which is the Amplify console. So we'll start with a simple one. We'll start with a Jekyll-based static website, front-end only. How many folks here have heard of Jekyll, using Jekyll? Okay, about half the room. And how many folks use some kind of static website or web app thing? If not Jekyll, something like Gatsby. Okay, good percentage of the room. Yeah, so these have become pretty fashionable recently. The nice thing is after you're done, you end up with static files. Static files are easy to reason about. They cache well. They work on CDNs properly. Chance of your site going down is much lower. So they've become pretty popular, and there's a bunch of them. Jekyll is one of them. And it's a good way to show some of the features that we offer in the Amplify console. And through the demo, you're going to see how you can make something globally available really easy, how you can do custom domains, how this feature branch thing works, like how Git feature branches map to DevOps workflows. You'll see the atomic deployment piece, and you'll see how you can enable password protection. Okay. And this is the same picture I showed earlier, except it's just the front end with one minor nuance here. So you'll see here that I have my old version of the site running, so CloudFront to S3, CloudFront to Lambda Edge to S3. New site gets uploaded. Only after it's fully uploaded does that pointer flip to point to my new site. So that's what we mean by atomic deployments. All right, I'm going to flip to live demo now. All right, so what I've done here is I just picked a somewhat arbitrary Jekyll theme that's available on GitHub, MIT license, and I forked it into my own account ahead of time. Currently, there's a master branch and a GitHub Pages branch. So what I want to do is create now I'm going to create a scenario where I'm actually working on this. I'm going to create a branch in this repo and then make some changes, and then show you how you can deploy both our production Jekyll website and our development Jekyll website using the Amplify console. So if you're familiar with Jekyll, a very important file in Jekyll is this config.yaml file. Okay, thank you for the marketing. All right, so I'm going to make a really small change here. So the title is currently called Moon. So I'm going to create a branch and call it Moon Development to indicate when someone hits the site, which one is dev versus which one is prod. So let me go ahead and hit edit. I'm going to change my title to Moon Development. I'm going to hit commit. But instead of committing directly to the master branch, I'm going to create a new branch for this commit. I'll just take the default, propose the change. Okay. And create the pull request. So now if I come back here, you'll see indeed I have a new branch, master, along with this patch. And the only difference between the patch and the master is that change that I made. Yep, update to the config YAML. Okay, so now let's go ahead and deploy this. So I'm going to pivot to the Amplify console, and I'm going to press this Connect App button to connect, to wire up this GitHub repo with the Amplify console. We offer a choice of repository providers. I'm going to pick GitHub, because that's where my code is at, but you can certainly use code commit as well. Okay, and then it's introspecting my GitHub account, looking for all the different repos. And Moon should show up here. There it is. And I can pick a branch. So I'm going to deploy both of them just to kind of show you how easy it is to do, to create a workflow for each branch. So I'll start with master, hit next. Okay, really cool feature here is it figured out it was a Jekyll site. So I'm going to zoom in a little. So if you see here, it figured out the pre-build step, bundle install. It figured out the build command, which is bundle exec Jekyll-based. So it figured out it was a Jekyll site and what to do. And it also figured out the base directory. Because oftentimes in Jekyll sites, the root folder is not the root folder. It's actually a subfolder called site. It was able to figure all of that out. I'm going to hit next and save and deploy. All right, so this part takes about 15 or 20 seconds to create the project. Once that's done, I'm going to create one more workflow for that patch branch as well. And then while it's actually deploying, we'll walk through some of the features in the console. right? So you can see here it's kicked off. Right after it wires up the branch, it kicks off a build, so it's starting the build. So while this is happening, let me connect the other branch now. It's smart enough not to show the same branch again, so I'm going to pick that patch branch, hit next. Again, it auto-detected everything, hit next, and hit save and deploy. Okay, so now you see I have two branches. This one will start in a second. I have two branches wired up, and they're both kind of building and deploying right now. So while this is going on, let's look at some of the other features that are available. The first one is domain management. So I have the ability, by default we do give you a domain with SSL. So if you see here, all the sites have the Amplify app subdomain, then sort of a unique identifier after that. And this part's pretty cool. We automatically just give that part of the domain the name of your branch by default. So you don't have to do anything. Once this thing is done deploying, you get master.whatever.amplifyapp.com, and the name of the branch, something.amplifyapp.com. That's just out of the box. And potentially for your development scenarios, that's sufficient. That said, you can add custom domains pretty easily. We support two ways of doing it. I don't actually have a Route 53 domain, but if I did, it's fully automatic. So you type in your Route 53 domain right here. We configure everything for you, and it's wired up. You don't have to have your domain on Route 53. You can instead type in a domain. Okay. It figures out that this domain is registered. Hey, make sure you're actually the owner. So I hit save. And then it's going to walk me through some steps for wiring it up manually. So it's not as automated if it's outside, obviously, but we still walk you through the steps. Okay, so in a few seconds, it will show some steps for wiring up. There we go. Yep, your domain has not been verified. View DNS records, and it walks you through the set of things you have to do on your domain registrar to wire up this domain to this website or web app. Okay. If you want to tweak the build settings after the fact, you certainly can. So even though we picked smart defaults, you can edit it, and we'll persist it for you, or optionally, you can have branch-specific build settings if you want. So I could download this file, tweak it, check it into source control, and from that point onwards, that will kind of take precedence over what's here. I can get notified by email. I can set environment variables. So you might be wondering, what does an environment variable mean in a static website? It's an environment variable that you can use during build. So I think a very canonical use case here is let's say your backend was deployed using something else, like code pipeline and code build, and you want to be able to take the front end here and have it point to that backend. So what you could do as part of your builds, as part of this configuration, is define environment variables, and then in your build settings, have a script that reads those environment variables and generates configuration that your front-end app uses. And then we have access control, like I mentioned earlier. So what I'm going to do here, actually, by default, they're both publicly viewable. What I'm going to do here instead is make my that patch release password restricted, because I don't want the public seeing something that hasn't been shipped broadly just yet. Okay. So now it's password protected. And then finally, I want to show you rewrites and redirects. So we give you some just out of the box. You can disable them if you want. But we're assuming that you're going to want your www, at least when you have custom domains, you're going to want your www to redirect to the apex domain or the root domain. And also we say if there's ever a file not found, just redirect to index.html. If you're doing a SPA, this is technically not a SPA, but if you're doing like a single page app where you only have index.html, then you might want to also add a rule for just like this, but for 200 as well, to make sure you always get to index.html for things like push state routing. All right, so let's come back. Okay, so both builds have succeeded. Let me show you the sites first, and then we'll come back and look at what you can see out of the logs. So this is my master. Okay, really easy, deployed with very minimal effort. And this is my my patch or my dev version. Okay, cool, it's prompting me for the password because I said I want it to be password protected. And there it is behind the password. Sure, and you can see here that this is indeed the development version, whereas this one is the production version. So really, really easy to get kind of DevOps up and running. So a couple other cool things. So I'll click into the branch. All right, so we tell you how long the build took. We give you logs broken down by step. So this is our work. Then we clone the repo so you can see if the clone was successful or there were warnings. Then we build the front end. Later I'll show you how you can build the back end too. We deploy so you can see all the files. This is good for debugging. If your site's not working, you can see all the files that were copied. And then this part is cool. So you can see actually screenshots on a bunch of different devices. So I'll zoom in here, and as you'd expect for a responsive web app on the Google Pixel cell phone kind of form factor, it looks really different than it does on a tablet. Over time, we'll be adding we'll be adding more based on customer feedback. All right, I think that's all I had to show for this part of the demo. So let me pivot back. Oh, yeah. All right. I'll take a show of hands on this one. We can potentially skip the video or come back to it at the end. How many folks use Gatsby? Heard of Gatsby? Okay, small. Okay, I'll save. If we have time, I'll save this one to the end. So I'll move ahead right now. Okay, so now let's graduate from like that front end only website to like a true serverless web app with a front end and a back end. And I'm going to use, kind of as the backdrop for this, I'm going to use a chat application. So it's a React.js based chat application. Under the covers, it uses AppSync for data, Cognito for analytics, Cognito for auth, and Pinpoint for analytics. It's offline enabled, so if you temporarily go offline, you can still see your chat history, and it's real time. Someone types into one chat window, you can see the chat in the other window, and vice versa. Okay, the architecture for this, just to recap, there's a front end and a back end. The communication with the back end happens from the browser. Okay, and we're going to walk through these workflows with examples. Okay, so before I do that, I wanted to announce something else that we also announced on Sunday, and that's multi-environment support in the Amplify CLI, which is part of the Amplify framework. So you can use a lot of the best practice I'm about to show even without the Amplify CLI. The Amplify CLI just makes it easier. And basically what it lets you do is define environments. Once you've defined environments, you can add backend features like auth and analytics and data. And under the covers, when you type in commands, we're creating CloudFormation templates that you can then check into source control. Also, we generate environment-specific configurations. So we ask you the first time, hey, do you want to use an existing environment or create a new one? If you say create a new one, the first time you actually deploy that backend as part of that environment, we save all the settings in the JSON file. And then later you can create a second environment, third environment, fourth environment, and you can basically have a way to deploy multiple instances of the same stack in a really clean way, in a way that works with source control and other team members. Okay, and just to illustrate, it's part of the CLI is also part of Amplify. Technically, it's not part of the developer tools piece; it's part of the framework. Okay, and you can. Even though the console really kind of advocates a single workflow for front end and back end, that's not necessarily true for the CLI. You can use the CLI either way. So you can use the CLI to deploy the front end and back end as a unit, which is what I'm going to show you. And the benefit of that is only one workflow to manage, less chance of drift, et cetera. But you don't have to do that. You can certainly deploy the front end and back end separately. In other words, a different workflow, a distinct workflow for the front end and the back end. And the benefit of that, of course, is you can share the back end across all your front ends. The risk is that you can have drift between your front end and back end. And a way you can do this, I'm not going to demo it today, but a way you can certainly do this is use the Amplify console, for example, for the front end, and code pipeline for the back end that you've created using the CLI. Okay. I'm going to actually show this live, so I'll just quickly talk to the slide and go back to demo. But to give you a color of how this works, I'm basically showing here, I check out a branch called my sandbox. I run this command, amplify init, which then asks me, do I want to create an environment or use an existing one? I create a new one. I start adding a bunch of features. And when I'm done, I can deploy it, and I can also save to source control, basically. And then someone else can check out their own branch. They can merge my changes so that they get all of the structural changes, like they get the fact that I was using Cognito, the fact that I was using AppSync, the schema for AppSync, but then they can then push to their own environment. That's what's happening here. So basically the best practice, I guess, in this case is or the example being shown in this case is the structure. So the CloudFormation templates get checked into source control, but the environment-specific settings don't. So therefore, when someone runs this command, they get a fresh environment. Alternatively, we also support shared backends. So in this case, each team would check out the same branch. One or both of them may be working on the back end, and then we have a facility, which you can see at the bottom here, called Amplify Environment Pull to sync the back end changes into your source control repo. So that allows multiple parties to work on the back end at the same time, but still use Git as a means for merging conflicts. I'm not going to show that one today, but just a note that it is possible. All right, so I'm going to switch back to demo again. So we're going to put it all together. We're going to use the Amplify CLI plus the console. Actually, it's more than deploy. We actually build a serverless web app, and then we're going to deploy it. Okay, good. All right. So I'm on Windows. I'm using Windows subsystem for Linux, so it's Ubuntu, technically kind of the Ubuntu experience, but running on Windows. Don't know if anyone else here used that successfully? Okay, a couple of folks. All right. Okay, so I went ahead of time. I bootstrapped the skeleton of a chat app, if you will, using Create App. So Create React App is a tool for the React.js community that basically bootstraps a starter React.js app. Doesn't do anything really other than just bootstrap the app. So if I flip to VS Code, you'll see right now there's nothing related to a backend at all, right? There's just the source, which is the source for my front end, node modules, which I can't remember if I installed or not. Looks like I didn't yet. But that's basically it. No backend, no Amplify stuff yet. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is run Amplify init. And that's basically saying, hey, I want to start adding backend resources to this app. Okay, enter a name for the project. I'll just pick the default. And so this is the environment piece. Enter a name for the environments. I'm going to pick my sandbox. Pick the editor, JavaScript, and this is React. Okay, it auto-detects as much as it can, so it figured out my source directory is source, build. It's going to accept all the defaults here, and AWS profile. Today we only support CloudFormation. The framework is open source, so it's certainly possible if someone had the time and energy to support other infrastructure sort of templating solutions besides CloudFormation. We went out of the door with CloudFormation. Okay, So now what's happening is it's creating sort of a skeleton stack in the cloud. It's creating a CloudFormation template basically with nothing in it just yet. But that's going to serve as sort of the outer stack for the features I'm going to then add. So this part is reasonably fast, and it creates IAM roles, as you can see as well. Okay. I'm going to switch to the console really quick. CloudFormation, refresh. Okay, you see here create in progress. So it's basically just orchestrating CloudFormation. Okay, after this is done, I'm going to actually add features to my app. So auth, data, and analytics. All right. Give me a few hints. I can say amplify status as an example. Okay, it's reinforcing my environment is sandbox, but I don't actually have any features yet. So let me go ahead and add some features. So amplify add auth. Oh, yeah, let me go back to VS Studio, or VS Code, sorry. And you'll see here now in Amplify, there's this Amplify folder that got created side by side with my source folder. Within here is a backend folder that's still basically empty because I don't have any backend features yet. And also there's this file called teamprovider.json, which basically is a description of the environment. And we can recreate the backend folder basically from this team provider info.json. So you can see right now it has the auth role, unauth role, the region, but really no features just yet. Okay, so let me add some stuff now. I'm going to add auth. I'm going to pick defaults just in the interest of time. Okay. Now if I do amplify status, it hasn't actually pushed to the cloud yet. It's just kind of staged everything locally. You'll see that, okay, now auth is ready to be deployed. If I switch back to VS Code, you'll see in the backend folder we have auth now. And this is a nested CloudFormation template, nested underneath that master template. Okay, now we're going to add analytics. I think Pinpoint doesn't like hyphens, so I have to change this. Let's remove the hyphen. Okay, it's just asking, do you want to allow guest and unauthenticated users to send analytics events? Normally that's a good idea, unless your app is only usable with a login. Okay, now if I do amplify status again, you'll see that we have auth and analytics. In the VS folder, you'll see, in VS Code, you'll see both. And then finally, I'm going to add a slightly harder one. I'm going to add API for AppSync. Okay, I can choose between GraphQL and REST. In our implementation, GraphQL will provision AppSync. REST will provision API Gateway. Take the default. Whoops, it doesn't like hyphens either. Okay, fine. I can pick how I want to authorize access using API key or user pool. It shows user pool because I configured Cognito early on. So I can pick that. If I have a GraphQL schema, this part is pretty cool. It will actually create the AppSync API as well as the underlying DynamoDB instance as well. So I do actually have a GraphQL schema. I believe it is this schema.graphql. And it's basically a GraphQL schema for a chat application, so conversations, users, that kind of stuff. Okay? And I won't belabor you again with amplify status, but you know what's going to happen. Okay, and then I can run amplify push, and it's going to deploy the backend to the cloud, the entire backend to the cloud as 3 nested stacks, 1 for each of those 3 features. So I'm going to start this. This part does take a fair amount of time, so I'm going to minimize this window. Yes, I want to continue. Okay, and also it's this is the code gen stuff I was telling you about earlier. It figured out, okay, hey, you're deploying a GraphQL API. Maybe you want to actually get some code, some client code generated for you. So I can say yes. I can pick between JavaScript, TypeScript, Flow. Audience have a preference? Okay, I hear TypeScript, good. I can specify how I want the files generated. Yes. And it's going to create an API.ts TypeScript file. Okay, this does take a while, so I'm going to minimize it. Start another window. Okay, so this is the fully built out app. So if I do here, amplify status, you'll see that there's no change. So it's actually, I deployed the backend prior to this talk, and there's no change. Now I can do a developer flow where I actually run the front end of the app locally against the resources that are in the backend, and the glue that gets generated. I'll show you this really quick too. So when you run those amplify push commands, the glue that gets generated is this AWS exports.js. So if I open this, you'll see that we take all that stuff from the team JSON, recognize you're in the my sandbox environment, inject it into a JavaScript file that your app can then use. So this is kind of the magic between the front end and the back end if you use the Amplify toolchain. You know, if you were using disconnected workflows, let's say like code pipeline for the back end and Amplify console for the front end, you'd have to somehow, you could generate this file, but you'd have to somehow get this file into the Amplify console. If you use them all, if you just use Amplify console, this file gets generated as part of the toolchain, and it just works. All right, so let me exit here. All right, so now I can do Amplify serve. And what that does is it will deploy the backend if needed, but there's no changes, so it's not going to actually deploy the backend. And then it will just launch the app locally on a local host instance. So remember, this is where it's helpful that it knew that it's React, because it's going to actually launch the kind of mock, or the web server, and it's going to start the app. So again, running locally using backend resources in the cloud. Starting dev server, okay. All right, there we go. I was already logged in, and I had a conversation going with a friend in my team. So let me actually open another window. Localhost 3000. Pretend that I'm him. Okay, so we see this conversation. You know, it's offline enabled, has history, so I can see prior chats we've had. Demo going well. Okay, pivot back to the other screen, pick the conversation. You should see it there. Okay, so that's what I have right now. Now let's say I wanted to graduate this app to the clouds, so the front end and the back end to the cloud as an isolated stack. How would I do that using the Amplify console? So the first thing I would do, which I'll spare you from, but I'll just talk through it, is I would take what I've built here, I would commit it to source control, and it would persist in GitHub into the my sandbox branch, that then somebody else on my team could then merge and bring into the dev branch and bring into the prod branch. So that's already been done. So let me pivot now to the GitHub console here and go to ChatQL, this one. Okay, so that was those merges already happened. So if I look at my branches, I now indeed do have a dev and a master branch. And the dev and the master branch are exactly the same as my sandbox, except I've done the same thing I did before. The dev branch says ChatQL dev, and the master branch will say ChatQL master. Otherwise, they're the same They're the same thing. Now I want to actually deploy this thing using the Amplify console. So let me go back. Okay. So I've already, I cheated a little bit. I already deployed the dev branch. So let me go ahead and kick off the master branch. And then we'll come back and look at the dev branch. Okay, so very similar experience to what we saw before. I pick a branch. Dev doesn't show up since it was deployed already, so I pick, shall we pick prod, not master, prod. Okay, and again, we spend a fair amount of time on this auto detection stuff. So in this case, it figured out that there is a backend. So it actually detected that there is indeed a backend. And it has some commands here to make sure that the backend can get deployed. Again, you don't have to use this. This is optional. You'll see. And then after it deploys the backend, it detected the front end as well. And what it detected the front end is React-Amplify, meaning the front end is React, and then the backend is Amplify. So I'll hit next. And the first time I do this, I would have had the choice for like front end only or front end plus back end, because I already configured the master branch. It's just inheriting that. It's going to deploy the front end plus the back end. Okay. So that's going to kick off in the same way that we saw for the Jekyll site earlier. Okay, so while that's getting kicked off, let me go to dev and show you the couple differences here now between what we saw earlier. The first thing that's different is you'll see this backend build step that runs before the front end build step. If I expand this, you'll see some stuff going on here that's really similar to what we saw earlier. The backend environment is getting created using CloudFormation. It's smart enough that after it does the first deployment, subsequent deployments will not blow away the entire stack. It will only do the deltas. Okay. Again, we see the screenshots here. Again, some useful differences between tablet and phone. And then finally, I wanted to draw your attention to the environment variables. And you'll see here there are none. And that's kind of one of the interesting things about using this tool chain together. Because the build process generates a client artifact, you don't actually need environment variables to wire the two things together. If your backend lived externally, then you would be able to use the environment variables feature here to sort of wire up the front end with the backend. Okay. And finally, let me just go ahead and click into this dev thing that I deployed earlier. Just show you that it's actually running live. It's running live on amplifyapp.com. And it's clearly not the same instance I was just running. There are no conversations in the one that was, running locally. There's a live conversation. So really, really powerful way to deploy a pretty sophisticated app in just a few minutes, front end and back end, completely isolated stacks. All right. Okay. So, in summary, the serverless web apps we've been talking about today contain many moving parts across the front end and back end. The Amplify console provides a way to deploy even existing front ends in just very few steps, even if they aren't on AWS yet. Very, very much adopts Git-based workflow. You can build serverless backends using the Amplify CLI like I showed you today. That said, a lot of the best practices hold even if you don't use the Amplify CLI. The point is infrastructure as code. Use kind of the Git workflow to be able to merge from sandboxes up to test, up to prod. And then you can combine the Amplify CLI and console like I just showed you for a pretty efficient and agile experience for building front end plus back end. I think that's all I had. Also on Sunday, we created these nice little vanity URLs. So instead of me having to say like aws.amazon.com/amplify, I can just say now go to amplify.aws. So hopefully that's easier to remember. And that's all I got. Please hang around for Q&A. If you do have a question, there's a microphone right there. You can come up and ask. And then please do complete the survey. Hope you found this session valuable. And like I said, there's a bunch of other sessions the rest of the day today and tomorrow that will kind of build and extend on what we talked about just now. Thank you so much. Any questions? I ended a bit early to allow for questions. Could have gone a few minutes longer. But yeah, can you go to the mic if you don't mind?
And this might be a silly one, and it's probably already been asked before, but the CloudFormation that you code, Jen, is it possible to do that in YAML instead of JSON?
I don't actually know the answer to that. I just don't know. I know our CLI toolchain is pluggable, so if it's not there, I think it's something we could do relatively easily. But I apologize. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
Appreciate the information. In your demonstration, you basically created a new app that used Amplify to create the authentication and so on and so forth. What happens if you have an existing production environment? Can the same set of tools be integrated for that existing environment, or do you have to start from scratch?
So I think the question is if I have existing backend environment. Yeah. So the short answer is yes. Like you can use everything fully integrated, or you can use things a la carte. So absolutely you can use our libraries against existing resources too. There's absolutely no requirement at all that you have to provision your backend using our toolchain in order to use the libraries. The libraries still make life a lot easier. And then in terms of configuration, we offer a number of patterns. So one is you can create your own AWS exports.js however you want. So let's say you're using code pipeline to deploy your backend. You can terminate, at the end of that process, you could generate an AWS exports.js that you then somehow get to your app, and your app would just be able to use that. So certainly you could do that. And also we provide ways in code you can provide configuration as well. So if you don't want to use a file, you can in code do it as well, read environment variables, for example. Yeah, so things work best together, but there's no requirement that you have to use the things together.
In any of those talks, do you guys offer any sample code or examples of integrating it with iOS?
With sorry?
In any of those talks today, there's you showed on one of those slides. There are a couple more talks today and tomorrow, I believe. So Amplify and iOS, is there any sample code, any examples how you do it?
Yes, okay, yeah, great question. The question is around Amplify iOS. Do we have sample code? So yeah, short answer is yes. So if you go to amplify.aws and then click on Get Started, it will take you actually to a GitHub site. And the GitHub site lets you pick your platform, iOS, Android, web, or React Native. Within web, we have a bunch of stuff, Vue, Angular. But yeah, within iOS, there's absolutely sample code. In full transparency, I'd say the maturity of our iOS library is a few months behind that of JavaScript. But we're doing a bunch of stuff there. Like just a few weeks ago, we launched much improved auth support in the iOS SDK. It kind of gets auth at parity with what we have in JavaScript. But yeah, amplify.aws is your single place to get started, and you can route from there. Good question. All right, well, thank you. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Hope you found the session valuable. Thank you.